Well, hello everybody and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you all are having a great day, whatever day it is out there. I don't know what day I'll be sharing this. I just pre-record as I drive, as I fly. And we see when we're going to share them based upon how the wind blows. But we're going to be continuing on today with number 4 in our series, 100 Reasons Why the New Testament is Only About Israel. And we're just cruising. We're cruising for a bruising. And we're cruising right along. We looked at a couple passages from 1 Corinthians, chapters 10, chapters 12. We also looked at James 1:1, which was a doozy of a passage. And again, the point, if you're late to the table here, the point of this series is just to give you 100 ironclad, concrete reasons from the New Testament, plucked out in no particular order, that prove IO to be totally true and irrefutable. And it's funny because a gentleman commented on one of the more recent ones and said that I was cherry-picking verses. And it was interesting because I only showed in that teaching how Paul was writing to the descendants of Israel clearly, because he said all of our fathers passed through the Red Sea and were baptized into Moses, and that these events were written down and were recorded and actually happened as examples for these ones living in the last days. So it just really makes more sense, doesn't it, if this is all about Israel? But he said that I was cherry-picking and plucking out verses like I shouldn't have been. But really, all I was doing was showing audience relevance, right? That's a big thing that people do. When you start coming around to the fulfilled view, you start to pay attention to audience relevance. And so it clearly would be wise to look at who Paul is writing to and what he's saying to them. And so that's what I did. But I just thought that to be kind of funny. Anyways, we're going to continue on, again, in no particular order. We're just going to jump around and show you some of the more powerful New Testament arguments and passages and verses that prove IO and that are really irrefutable. You know, I mean, when we get arguments from people, for example, Isaiah 49, light to the Gentiles, which is actually a light to the nations. That's all that word means, is nations. And if we look at other places in the prophets, we see that the light always went out to the nations. We see that the banner always was set up for the nations, but it was set up for the nations and the light went out to the nations for the purpose of God's salvation reaching the ends of the earth. But if you look around and in those particular portions where it talks about banners and lights, specifically Isaiah chapter 11, Isaiah 49, Isaiah 60, all these different things, you'll always notice that Israel is at the forefront, right? You don't have to look very hard. You can see that Israel was in the nations, Israel was lost and scattered, and Israel was being saved. God was having mercy, and salvation was reaching them wherever they were, as far and wide as they were scattered. And this is a theme that we see repeated throughout the Old Testament, right? So to think that the New Testament mission... I was getting a call there. I don't know if that messed me up a little. It might have. But to think that the New Testament is anything other than that would be silly, right? I mean, why not just let the story say what the story has said so many times, and that is that this God was a jealous God and was very much concerned with the salvation of his people wherever they were, near or far. And so, so what you'll see in these portions that I share is that they're really irrefutable, they're concrete, there's really no two ways about them. They say what they say, and they don't leave any room for curiosity or speculation. Whereas these other passages that are brought up in objection to IO are very gray. They're very shady. They're not concrete. They're not crystal clear. They're sort of tossed out there as a possibility or plucked from a different context in Israel's history and you know, forced into some imaginary spiritual narrative that people have today. So it really doesn't work. But today we're going to be looking at one that we've looked at many a times. I mean, many a times. I've taught on this many a times. And it's one of my favorite ones. And I'll tell you a little story. When I first became IO and I got a bunch of followers or a bunch of subs in the beginning, how it happened was I went over to Don K. Preston's page, his YouTube channel, and I dropped a bomb in the comments. And it was a sneak attack. It was before he had banned me from commenting on all of his platforms. And what I did is I sort of hit him with the sneak attack where I went through and I just gave a very concise and crystal clear, ironclad layout of Israel only. I started in the beginning. I showed the trajectory, I finished it off in the end with all Israel being saved by Jesus in the last days and taken to their kingdom. And a lot of people were very interested. In fact, there was a big uproar on his page and on his channel about, oh my God, what about this? And it was interesting because immediately I probably got 100 subscribers to my channel when I did that. And many of you who still listen, I recall that you came over here from the Don K. Preston channel by seeing some of the things that I said in those exchanges before I was banned. So one of the main things that I stressed in those comments on Don K. Preston's channel was Romans 9 and what Paul does in Romans 9 to really give away the goose. Now, I posed it as a real problem for them, because if Paul was trying to define these Gentiles in Romans 9 as anyone other than Israel, well, he did a horrible job of it, right? An absolute horrible job of it. He actually said the exact opposite. He said that the Gentiles, the ones of Romans 9 who were receiving the mercy from this God, were actually the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He says it flat out. And then he repeats that sentiment 2 chapters later in Romans 11 when he says the fullness of these Gentiles or these nations coming in will have an end result of all Israel being saved. And so Romans 9 was a real hard spot for Don K. Preston. Never did get a good answer. Still haven't to this day. When people try to argue against it, they usually end up giving up, going away, or just kind of getting upset. But we'll just look at it quickly. We're not going to read all of it, but Paul is going on in Romans 9 and talking about God's sovereignty and election, and talking about, what shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God because he chooses to have compassion on some and not on the others? Right? And doesn't that just make sense that he's talking within a general context? God is choosing to have compassion on some and choosing to harden others, right? Well, then he goes on and he talks about Pharaoh and how he hardened his heart for their purpose. And he goes on, he says, therefore he has mercy on whom he wills, and whom he wills he hardens. And then he goes forward, he says, you will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who has resisted his will? Blah, blah, blah. Haven't you made me like this? But then Paul says in verse 21, does not the potter have power over the clay from the same lump to make the vessel for honor and another for dishonor? Well, what's interesting is if you go back and do a little digging in the Old Testament, you'll see who was the clay, right? Who was the clay? Israel was God's clay, and he was the potter, and he formed them in his hands. The Old Testament is ripe with these different statements calling Israel the clay. So why would this be any different? Why would now the term the clay be referring to anyone other than Israel? But let's keep that in mind and go on to what he says in verse 22. He says, what if God, wanting to show his wrath and to make known his power, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, interesting, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy which he had prepared for glory? Even us whom he called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles, right? Okay, so now Paul is lobbing up a softball pitch of a question here. He's going to answer it. He's going to mysteriously and esoterically reveal this mystery that's going on right now. And he's asking, what if God is also having mercy upon these individuals out in these nations, right? He's saying, is God also having mercy on these Gentiles? And he goes on, he quotes Hosea in verse 25. He says, as he also says in Hosea, I will call them my people who are not my people, and her beloved who is not my beloved. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. So interestingly enough, Paul asks who these Gentiles are that are receiving mercy from God here in these final days. And he quotes a passage from Hosea, which is all about the lost sheep of the house of Israel being dispersed and lost and paganized and swallowed up, but now becoming a people once again, becoming God's people once again. But it gets a lot better. In verse 27, he continues on answering that rhetorical question, and he says, Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel. Now, this is a problem, because his question is not about the Jews, right? His question there was not about the Jews. He acknowledged that God was having mercy on the Jews. His question was concerning the Gentiles. Is God also having mercy upon the Gentiles, he proclaimed and asked, right? So he asks about the mercy on the Gentiles, and he answers it by saying, Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel. So wait a minute. I thought we were talking about Gentiles here. What is he doing quoting something from Isaiah that's all about Israel? And look what he says. This is the quote. Though the number of the children of Israel, I thought we were talking about Gentiles, be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved. For he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because the Lord will make a short work upon the earth. Now, isn't it suspect that Paul decided that when he was going to answer the question about the mercy that was befalling or coming upon these specific Gentile individuals, these ones out in the nations, these ones lost and scattered, isn't it suspect that he thought it would be a good idea to quote a passage about the number of the children of Israel being very massive and very vast, but a remnant of them being saved? Something's not adding up. And I contend and plead with you to think logically here. The reason why Paul is quoting Old Testament passages all about Israel being lost, swallowed up, gathered, but then saved again, is because that's precisely what was taking place in those mystical, magical last days we call the New Testament. Israel was being gathered far and wide. And he doesn't even end there. He goes on again with another passage to help iron out and explain these mysterious Gentiles even more. He says, and as Isaiah said before, unless the Lord had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom, and we would have been made like Gomorrah. Well, who's the ones that he's speaking about? He's still answering the question about these mysterious Gentiles who are receiving mercy. Okay? He's asking the question, are these mysterious Gentiles having mercy? Is God having mercy on these specific mysterious Gentiles, these ones in the nations? And he quotes this passage a third time from Isaiah, saying, unless the Lord had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom and been made like Gomorrah. In other words, this is Israel. There was a seed of Israel left out in the nations, and unless the Lord had left that seed, they would have been destroyed. But they were out there, and God was having mercy upon them. And here's the final tie-in so that I can leave you guys with a little wow moment, okay? You'll notice that I always like to go back to Deuteronomy 4 and thereabouts. And the reason I do is because that's the establishment of the tale. That's the real start of the story. Now, sure, there's a backstory. Sure, there's a patriarchal backstory, whether it be true, myth, false, fairy tale, who knows? Could just be oral tradition, Noah, Adam, Cain, and Abel. Could have just been Israel's fatherly, patriarchal oral tradition that was written and handed down. Who knows what it was. But it was surely a backstory to Israel. It can't be anything else, because the start of the real story occurs with Israel. That's when you lock in on them, and you're hand in hand with them for the rest of the way. There is no deterring off of them. They are the main character, without a doubt. So here we have Deuteronomy 4, which I always come back to, because Moses really shows what this is all about. Moses was commissioning the Israelites to really take this seriously, this law and this covenant and these commandments that God was giving them. And he told them that if they didn't, they would be cursed. He outlined a huge list of curses. It was so curse heavy. It wasn't even funny. Yet somehow we think that the curse that the Bible speaks of was not that same curse. We think it was some imaginary curse of people breaking an imaginary law that they were never given, and being doomed for it nonetheless. But of course, the curse of the Bible was the curse that Moses outlined in the beginning. It was the curse of not obeying every commandment written in the book. It was the curse of the law. Okay? Just like Paul said in Galatians. Right? The law was the curse, and as many who are under the works of the law were under the curse. That's what it was all about. And so Moses tells them, he says, listen, you're going to screw up. You're going to make mistakes. You're not going to take this seriously. And in the latter days, he tells them, this is an anchor text for me. If you know what an anchor text is, I tie a lot to this because it's irrefutable. Moses in Deuteronomy 4 says, in the latter days, Israelites, You will be paganized. You will be idolized. You will be out in the nations worshiping wood and stone that doesn't speak or hear or touch or see. But in those latter days, you will be out there. The Lord will seek you. You will turn to him. And notice what Moses tells them in Deuteronomy 4. He says, and he will have mercy upon you. Mercy upon you. Right? Well, if these Israelites were supposedly going to be out in the nations paganized, worshiping idols and wood and stone, well, they would be pagans, right? They would be Gentiles. They certainly wouldn't be Jews. A Jew didn't do that. These are pagans. These are Gentiles. It simply just means outside of the religious body that was a Jew or Jews. So Moses called it. He predicted it. He said, you're going to be out there, but God is going to turn and have mercy upon you. And he's going to remember the covenant that he made with your fathers and bring you back. Well, wouldn't you know, Romans 9, what is Paul asking about specifically with regards to these Gentiles? What's he asking about? He's asking about the mercy that God was having upon them. His exact question was, let's see, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had prepared beforehand for glory, of us whom he called not only the Jews, but also of the Gentiles. So in other words, he's speaking of the mercy that was coming upon the Gentiles, aka the mercy that was coming upon those living in the nations, living in Rome. And he's asking about it. But doesn't that match beautifully with what Moses predicted would happen with the Israelites? God would seek them out and he would have mercy upon them wherever they were, however they were led, whatever idols they were worshiping. Right? Acts 17 ring a bell where Paul goes up to those men and tells them, listen, since we're the offspring of God, we ought not be doing this. Okay? So that's my point, folks. Romans 9, Paul gives away the goose, using 3 clear Old Testament passages to define who the Gentiles were, who God was having mercy upon. And when we link that back to the promise Moses made that in the latter days, God would be having mercy upon these Israelites wherever they were, in whatever pagan, idol-worshipping state that they were, we can really see that this was all a promise that was made to Israel's fathers, and they were heirs according to that promise. And they were being gathered in before the end. Clearly, yet again, showing that this tale has nothing to do with you or I, and it was all about Israel. Folks, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a like-a-rooski. If you didn't, please, please, please take a hike-a-rooski, and we'll catch you on that flip side. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.